All right, everybody. Thanks for coming to this last session. And this one's on program theory. This is an area that is really important to assessment, but doesn't get talked about nearly enough. So, um, a few things that I hope you all get out of this session is one, that you're able to articulate what program theory is at the end, and two, differentiate between three levels of program theory. So, in the last session, we talked about different levels of assessment quality in a report. This is sort of the same type of comparison, but now we're just talking about the program theory part of it. Oops. So, as an overview, I'm going to be talking about engagement first. By the way, at FIU, is engagement something that people talk about? Is engagement something you all talk about a lot? So, engagement's a term that we use a lot at JMU. In fact, we're trying to be the national model of an engaged university. And so I've had to really think about what does engagement mean. I'm going to try to tie it back into assessment. Also want to provide some important quotes about what people have said about program theory, talk about the definition of program theory, and then talk about the very poor, and good versions of program theory to let you see what the difference is among those areas, and finally a little time for Q&A. Okay, so engagement. If I were to ask you how you define engagement, you likely struggle, or you might say different things about what engagement means. I know we've had that issue on our campus. So when we've combed through the literature, we've seen at least 5 distinct ways that people talk about engagement. And so one of them is the educational activities themselves. That's called engagement sometimes. Sometimes it's students' responsiveness to an educational activity. So for example, a student who is asleep at her desk would be unengaged versus a student who is looking very excited, paying attention, asking questions. That person is more engaged. That's a second way. A third way is the application area. So if you hear civic engagement, it's being engaged in civic related things. Fourth is sometimes it's a student learning outcome in and of itself. So for example, when people talk about voting, sometimes voting is a student learning outcome. They want students to vote. So it's a student learning outcome. And last is involvement between university and outside communities. So those are different ways that people talk about engagement. I want to focus just on that top piece. And this is the piece that also relates to assessment the most. So are y'all familiar with high impact practices as well? So high impact practices, I see some nods, some shaking of the head, but high impact practices are areas or activities that are supposed to produce high levels of learning, okay? High impact practices. They are, there's a group called AAC&U who really promotes high impact practices. George Kuh's group, the group that does NESI, really talks about high impact practices as well. And here's a list of these different areas, and you see them. There's 10 that are listed on the website. Okay, I'll give you just a couple minutes to look at those. What's that? Oh yeah, you're gonna have these slides as well. Yep. Okay, so these are high impact practices. So I'm going to make this huge transition here, okay? I'm going to go back to this high impact practice in just a minute, but bear with me. So here's a question. What were you doing in 1984, Wednesdays at 7 p.m.? Nothing, okay. Okay. Nothing at that time. Anybody else remember what they were doing? That's a long time ago. That's 35 years ago now, is that right? Yeah, hard to believe. 35 years ago. This is what I was doing. I was watching the TV show that came on at that time, and actually it relates to right here. It's Miami Vice, right? Anybody remember what those characters' names were? The characters' names? Yep, Crockett and Tubbs, right? And so they were the big stars. And you know, when I was in, I guess I was in elementary school at the time, but a lot of kids were wearing, um, you know, outfits like that. But the actual star that I'm referring to is not the two gentlemen there; it's the car behind them, and that was a big part of that show. Anybody know what type of car that is? You got the Ferrari part right. This is the Testarossa, right? Beautiful vehicle, right? Those lines on the side, just beautiful. All right, so you're like, where in the heck is he going? You know, we're talking about program theory. Now he's talking about Ferraris and Miami Vice. What's happening here? So I want to take this one step further and go to those Ferraris. And, um, sir, what is your name? Okay. So imagine the two of us are going out and we go to these garage and we see these two amazing vehicles. Okay. And um, let's say I get in the red Ferrari, he gets in the black Ferrari. Everybody with me there? So he gets into his Ferrari, presses on the gas, the car zooms, just as you would assume. And this car goes like 0 to 60 miles per hour in 4.5 seconds or something. It's a fast vehicle. I get into mine and I press the gas. Guess what? Nothing happens at all. Here's the difference. This Ferrari's got a Ferrari engine in it. It's got its V12. It's doing what a Ferrari should do. This other vehicle, the one that I'm driving, you look under the hood and there's nothing there. They both look like Ferraris, but only one really is. So let me let you read this quote, and it has to do with those high impact practices. I'll let y'all read it. So everybody with me on this? It's what I want to emphasize is that last paragraph. Campus practitioners knows firsthand that some service learning courses and internships are better designed and implemented than others. And so just because you call something a high impact practice doesn't necessarily mean it's high impact. That design and the implementation matter. And so I was kind of joking around here. So alternative names for HIPs, high impact, sometimes practice. Indeterminate impact practice, or higher education practice, impact dependent upon program theory and implementation. Now, the reason I bring this up is because in a lot of the conversations you'll have at conferences are like, how many students go through high impact practices? To me, I don't really care that much. I much more care about, well, first, what actually is a quality of that exercise. And then after that, then I want to figure out how many students attended. But just because you have all your students traveling abroad doesn't necessarily mean that they got anything out of it. And so, again, impact dependent on program theory and implementation. Here's another quote for you. I'll let you read this one. This is in Student Affairs. Okay, everybody with me? That's the last quote. I know that's a lot of text for a presentation like this. But it underscores the main point here, that if you're just looking at assessment scores, if you don't know the theory behind the programming that got you those scores, it's really hard to know what works in the program and what didn't. And so this is very much, hey, those programs were able to look under the hood and they're looking at the performance of their car, let's say. They have a much better way of describing what's happening. So you're able to talk about the entire system. And so for some of you all who were in the first workshop, I put up the assessment cycle here. And I just wanted to say, let me bring back program theory to the assessment cycle. Like, where is it? It's in these two pieces. So the first piece is where you create or articulate student learning outcomes. So this is what you want students to know, think, or do as a function of your program. And the second piece is aligning your curriculum. Actually, a little bit more than that too. It's also your pedagogy. But these are the interventions that you think are going to help your students get to the student learning outcomes. Now, these two pieces by themselves are not assessment. This is just saying, on paper, here's what we want students to learn, and on paper, here's what we think is going to get them there. But it's the starting point. And everything else is sort of the methodological part to tell you how good your program theory is. Everybody with me on that? Okay. This part, a lot of times people just sort of gloss over this. Let me write down some quick student learning outcomes. Let me say, well, I think this class hits this student learning outcome, and maybe not. But in essence, this is the core of what the program actually is. The other pieces should be wrapping around it. So let me do a little bit better job of actually defining program theory, right? The program theory is defined as the construction of a plausible and sensible model of how a program is supposed to work. So let's go back and let's break this down a little bit. So in essence, we're talking about an academic program. We're asking this question of cause and effect. What effect do we want to have on students? And what's going to cause that effect? So one of the cause is the program design itself. This is often your curriculum. Second is how the program is delivered. Both of those are important. And the desired effect is the intended student learning outcome. So let me give you like a hypothetical question. So if you're in a program, somebody come up to you and say, what are your student learning outcomes? You list them out. Then they would say, okay, so what are you doing to help students achieve those outcomes? How well can people justify the actions that are taken in that program to achieve the student learning outcomes? What evidence do they have to suggest that those things would actually be effective? Okay. Is everybody with me on that? So what I'm going to do now, I think it's kind of abstract program theory. But let me make this more concrete to show you, again, the bad example, or very poor in this case, a poor, and then a pretty good one. So student learning outcome, okay, absent. Intervention, students will read about the importance of ethical reasoning. Y'all see what the problem is? Like, first of all, we don't know what the outcome is. We don't know what we're trying to have students achieve. Then there's sort of, like, I would call this a naked intervention. Like, we're doing something, but we don't know why we're doing that thing. And then rationale. Well, if you don't have an SLO and an intervention, it's hard to give a rationale about how they should be related to one another. So let me give you another example. This is poor, but a little bit better. And this time, just because there's more text, I'm going to put in each piece one by one. So I'll give you the SLO and go one by one. So I'll let you read this. So you might remember this student learning outcome if you're in the last session. The SLO is okay. Here's the intervention. Faculty will be provided with reference materials addressing the importance of ethical reasoning and the rationale. So why do we think that that intervention is going to help students achieve that SLO? Okay, I'm going to stop for a second, and I'm going to ask you this question. Um, what concerns do you have about this program theory? And I'll pass the mic to you.
So it seems that the SLO is student focused, which is good, but the intervention and the rationale are faculty focused, and it doesn't show how what the faculty are learning and is going to impact the students. Like it doesn't have the like you were saying earlier the hook in terms of what's being assessed.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's right. Um, that intervention doesn't sound like it's bad. Like that might ultimately get you to a place where you need to be. But it seems to me that there's a lot of steps between that intervention to something that'll actually get students to do that student learning outcome.
The concern I have there is it seems like the faculty are not well aware of the ethical process and the importance, so, and they are teaching it. So, to me, that's a pretty big concern.
And so this would be, in my opinion, very loose program theory, because at least they've got a student learning outcome. There's some interventions that are happening, and there's some rationale, but it does seem pretty disconnected. So let me show you an example that's a little bit more connected. And just be aware the font's a little bit smaller because there's more information there, okay? So same SLO as before. Okay, now I want to give you a fuller intervention. Can y'all read that from where you are? Okay, great. Okay, what's different about this intervention than the past one? So what's different about this intervention than the last one?
It's specific and they're doing something. They're discussing it, they're seeing the video, and I think ethics is something that you have to discuss on a case by case basis.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the last time it was, again, the intervention was focused on the faculty, which, by the way, there probably is some faculty intervention as well that has to take place. But this intervention is more proximal to the actual student learning outcome as laid out, right? And so I'm also going to show you the rationale. So I'll let you read this. Okay, everybody with me there? So a couple of things to note is that they actually tied it into research, right? The intervention. So to say, we just didn't do this intervention out of the blue. We actually did some research to see what kinds of things might be effective, what kind of interventions might be effective for this kind of student learning outcome. So there's a lot of thought that went into it. And so I'm just sort of capping off those three slides that you saw, that if you go from like the very worst to the worst, it's just people are doing activities and there's no student learning outcome at all to hook it into. And then what's poor, but it's a little bit better, is that idea to say, hey, look, we're doing some interventions and we have some rationale for it, but it's not tightly linked up, nor is there actually any research base to provide support for it. And so the last example is just one small part of somebody's program theory overall. Just one student learning outcome. Here's just one activity to it, and here's a rationale for it. But what's interesting, we actually do this at our institution, and we actually are able to move the needle on students' ethical reasoning skills a little bit, but in a 75-minute intervention. That's pretty good to be able to do that in that period of time. And we basically use that program theory to help us out in our logic for it, okay? So we're gonna have some time for some Q&A at the end here, but I wanted to say, what I would suggest to you all is work on that program theory so you know what is under the hood of your programs. That's a really hard thing to do. Oftentimes we don't spend enough time on the front end thinking about the design of our programs. And so I want to highlight my colleague, Sarah Finney. So she does some of the best work in the nation on program theory. And she does a lot of conferences and writes a lot of articles. But she says, have you heard about program theory and implementation fidelity? Now, implementation fidelity is a little bit of a teaser, but I'll say that implementation fidelity is a thing that goes hand in hand with program theory. So program theory is, on paper, what do you want students to know, think, or do? And then what are the interventions, if it's good program theory, what are the interventions that we have evidence for that suggests that these interventions will actually work? That's on paper. Intervention fidelity is the degree to which your actual program matches or does not match to your planned program. One last piece, just to give you a sense of implementation fidelity, which I think is really interesting. This is sort of the next level of assessment. Is to give you a sense of it is the implementation fidelity is often talked about in healthcare. And so oftentimes it's talked about with prescriptions. So for example, imagine that you go to a doctor and the doctor says, hey, it seems like you have this virus, whatever it might be. And you need to take this pill 2 times every day for a week. You come back to the doctor's office and you're still sick, okay? So there's a couple of things that might happen. It could be that that medication was ineffective at helping you. But the doctor should ask, did you actually take the medication as prescribed? So the program theory was, you got this virus, you're presenting with it, here's the medication that has evidence of working. But if you come back and you're still sick, it could be an issue that that medication is not effective for you, or it could be that your actual practice did not match up with what's on paper. So anyway, that's sort of a little teaser there for you for implementation fidelity if you want to read more about it. So what other questions do you have?
More like advice. So my experience is I've been doing assessment in my department for 6 to 8 years, I guess. And I feel like the program, and we're going through curriculum mapping now, but the program exists sort of as a legacy program, right? And so our ability to really engage in this kind of conversation is somewhat limited by the curriculum existing as it exists, staffing built around the existence of that curriculum. And so there's a lot of hard questions that one would need to ask in order to really engage in this in a meaningful way. So I guess my question to you is, what are your suggestions for, like, in an environment where that exists, which I assume is probably pretty common? What are your suggestions for just beginning that conversation with faculty who may not want to look under the hood?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So sometimes I like to answer questions about what won't work, and that is to try to look at your entire curriculum and try to do strong program theory kind of from scratch. Because like you said, there's this legacy built up. And some people are really entrenched in it. And I get it that as a faculty member, you have a lot to do. And so by having materials that are already made for each class, boy, that saves a lot of time. If you had to reinvent everything, it would just take so much time to do it that it would be maybe an insurmountable obstacle. So what I would suggest is actually the same suggestion I have for learning improvement in general. That is, talk with the faculty and to see, is there a student learning outcome that we feel is so important that we're willing to spend our time rethinking how we treat that student learning outcome? And then for that one student learning outcome, say, you know what, let's do this right. Let's think about it from, let's break out this thing. Let's talk about what we want students exactly to do, and then look at the research to say what suggests would be helpful in each piece of that. And then our experience is once you have a program that has that taste of success, when they can show that this new program is more effective than the old one, then they say, hey, let's try another student learning outcome. But it's just breaking it off into a piece that you could actually chew and have some success with first. If you've got 12 student learning outcomes and you're like, hey, everybody, let's reinvent this and get program theory everywhere, I think it's just too challenging for most programs. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, pick one thing, do it well, and then go on from there. And so that's actually how I do anything that I think is going to be challenging, but I think is important. I always pilot it first. And so, for example, when we did learning improvement at the program level, we didn't ask all programs to try to do this awesome improvement. We picked a couple of partners, and then we're like, let's have success with the low-hanging fruit first. Because if we can't make it happen with them, why would it happen with anybody else? But then you have that success to say, here's some real stories that it worked, and go from there. So it just so happens that the computer information systems has got pretty tight program theory on that student learning outcome that they were working on. Our ethical reasoning, we spent a ton of time with that, but that's got some pretty tight program theory in places too. So I think have us go really deep on a small area, have success, and expand. Yeah. Yeah, so that really does vary from program to program how it's set up. So some disciplines, they have some national accrediting body that really specifies what the student learning outcomes are, and often even will suggest what the interventions are to teach it well. Other ones, there's a lot more flexibility with respect to the program, but that also means the onus is on them to have the design to build it. So there's pluses and minuses to both approaches. Another comment I'll make though is I think a lot of people would think that one can only improve if something is bad. And what I found out is it's almost impossible to name something that couldn't be improved. And strangely enough, maybe to some people, is that it's often the programs that are already pretty awesome and dynamic tend to be the ones who embrace learning improvement the quickest. And so I just found that the programs are doing a really good job. They can really point to say, this is the thing, though, that we don't think is as good as it should be. So, any final questions? Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me. Oh, well, thanks for sticking with me. Yeah. Y'all are the troopers. Okay.